Welcome back to Freedom to Know Wellness, Part 2, Q&A with patient and advocate Dr. Nkem Kalu. If you missed Part 1 of the full interview with Nkem, find the link in the description below. Just a reminder, Dr. Nkem Kalu is not a medical doctor, but her advocacy and lived experience will benefit our listeners, both patient and medical alike. In today's Q&A, Nkem will share some important details about her surgery. She even shares some interesting, humorous anecdotes about her attempts at reducing her surgical scars. For any woman, especially with melanated skin, this is a hot topic, as scarring can be more obvious on darker skin tones or prone to keloids. I had further questions about her decision on using copper IUDs, as there has been research about them possibly contributing to a breeding ground for fibroids for patients with a history of uterine fibroids. Find all supporting documents in the description below. I was interested in her comments on the effects of perming in Black women and their connections with uterine fibroids and wanted her to further expound on that. This and more will be divulged in today's discussion. Now, let's begin our interview. Please note, the information provided in this episode is from the opinions of the interviewee and interviewer. For further medical advice, please contact your practitioner. The images displayed in this video are of a graphic nature. Viewers' discretion is advised. Thank you again, Nkem, for taking the time to do this Q&A. In part 1 of our interview, we didn't get to discuss what were your pre-op process with your doctors. Also, did they discuss with you the type of cut they would perform for your myomectomy and how to manage your potential scarring post-surgery? A vain question, I know, but I had to ask.
So with regard to my pre-op, I didn't actually have a lot of conversations with the doctor about some of the more, I guess, cosmetic parts of the surgery. So they explained what the myomectomy was going to be. They didn't have, well, not actually, it's not that they didn't have it. It wasn't feasible to do, I think it's a laparoscopy where they have, they're able to just make a smaller incision, send in the probe, and target individual fibroids, because I had multiple fibroids that already showed up on the scan. They needed to take, I think also because of the location of the fibroids, they needed to take out my uterus to have a better look at what was going on, which is how they discovered the 19 masses that they removed. In terms of healing options, I was on a barrage of antibiotics and a bunch of other meds. Also because I was in Nigeria, and my immune system was weakened as a result of being ill, and then as a result of the surgery, I was in and out of the hospital a number of times because I caught malaria during my healing period. I just wasn't strong enough to withstand, getting malaria during that time. And so, I just remember, I think I spent probably about 6 weeks just in and out of hospital. Post-surgery, I think we didn't really even talk about, what kind of stitching would be used. As part of my healing process, they did say, it would heal over. There was a possibility of keloids due to like surgical scars, but from my past with minimal injuries, my body didn't act like I would have keloids. I didn't know what options were available to me with regards to healing, and I didn't ask. Just after my surgery, a friend of mine actually wound up having a C-section at a private clinic, a different private clinic in my area, and they actually used paper tape to help her with her healing. And so with the tape she had, as of today, she has, the scar is barely visible, and it healed better. Mine's kind of like your pretty typical garish C-section scar across my stomach. I did have an incident where I think I sneezed and rip the stitches out on one side, so the healing on the one side is a little bit more gnarly, I think, than across my stomach. I wish I had known that there were different options for for like healing and for the taping up of I guess, yeah, the seaming up of the different body parts. They did use what's the word? They did use the stitching thread that dissolves automatically after a period of time within the body. So that part was nice because I didn't have to go back to hospital to get my stitches removed. They just, they dissipated over time. But I can't lie, I'm totally jealous of my friend's tape. Um, but I think at this point now, I think it's important to talk to the doctors in retrospect about what the healing might look like and what the scarring might look like. I think I was just more preoccupied with dealing with the issue at hand and surviving, because my actual life and my well-being was on the line, that I didn't even think about like what the scarring would look like. I don't think I even thought about what the recovery process would look like prior to the surgery. All I knew was that I was in a lot of pain. I was very uncomfortable, and my health was in a very precarious position, and I needed to do everything that I could to have that taken care of. That being said, I think that the quality of care that I received was on par with the quality of care that, my friend received with regards to her C-section and my myomectomy. Um, but she probably paid 3 or 4 times what I paid for my surgery. And even though what I paid, um, I think in Nigeria at that time was quite expensive. Um, for my surgery, she went to, I guess it was a private hospital, but it was an internationally run hospital, so it was even more expensive. And from a vein perspective, yes, I wish I had the tape, but I know that like at that time, financially, because we don't have social um universal health care there. So like at that time it wouldn't have been conceivable or even worth it to pay that much just to have a better scar, or less of a scar. That being said, um I did try a number of like homeopathic options to help with the scarring, including some like old wives' tales and herbalist remedies. I think the most out there remedy that I tried was using, this is actually true, I use snake oil, and it's an oil extracted from under the skin. I think I want to say of pythons, that's sold as like a natural remedy, and it's believed to help with the healing process, help dissolve the keloids, and just to help reduce scarring. I'm not sure that it was as effective on me, but I know that like I purchased it, I tried it for a while, and then I gave up after a while. But there was this interesting stinky jar of literal snake oil um, in my fridge. Oh yeah, definitely tried some interesting things with regards to the scarring. Um, the other thing I did try to use was silicone tape. I bought when I had a friend travel to the UK, I had them buy me an insane amount of silicone tape. And that was actually really, really helpful with regards to just helping the scar itself heal down and break down. So yeah, with the silicone tape, I think that was probably um, the one scarring solution that I used most regularly and committed to. It was easy because I could put it on and then forget about it, and it was waterproof, so I could bathe with it, and it would stand for a number of days. I don't know if it's junk science, but it seemed to me to work very well. And then later on, when I was having any sort of like issues with scar tissue around my incision, I would go back and put the silicone tape on it. It could be total placebo effect, but it felt like it helped.
Although you had the benefits of having doctors that cared about preserving your womb, did your doctors discuss that there may be a potentially a reason for them to complete a hysterectomy during your surgery, or was this idea never discussed in your case?
In terms of the procedure itself and any consideration about a hysterectomy, we never ever discussed a hysterectomy. That was never a consideration, I think, for a number of factors. One, including my age, the fact that I hadn't had children yet, and that I wasn't married, and wanting to be able to, like, stay open to those things. And also, a hysterectomy wasn't needed at that point. Now, if the size of the tumors or the location um, of the tumors were, I guess, more troublesome, then that might have been perhaps part of the conversation, but then I would have been sedated at that point. So I'm not sure who'd have made the call. I imagine my parents probably would have, picked life over, well, my current life over a potential baby life in the future. Um, but yeah, typically hysterectomies are considered, like, I don't even know if they're considered as a treatment for fibroids in Nigeria. That was never a part of the conversation that I had at any point.
And Kim, you mentioned that your doctor has you on a hormone suppressant to manage your fibroids. How has been your experience overall now being on it, and has it helped in the reduction of your fibroids?
I am not particularly fond of the experience so far. In some ways, it seems convenient. Like, it's nice not having to worry about having a period regularly. I'm appreciating not having to spend a lot of money on sanitary products, etc. But being on the hormonal repression has been challenging in other ways. My skin's very dry. I just, like, I get what's the word I'm looking for? I get hot flashes at night. Um, it's Yeah, there's just some reactions, I think, as a result of this kind of chemical menopause that are less than ideal. And having been now on these meds for um, almost 4 years now, it feels as though this is like a constant state of being, and I think I'm looking forward to, like, kind of getting past this. And I'm not excited about, like, when I stop taking the meds and I have to actually go through menopause all over again. But I guess I've experienced it to some degree already, so maybe it won't be quite so challenging. um so yeah. In terms of whether the hormonal repression has reduced my fibroids, I think I mentioned a little bit about this. We're not really sure. So it has helped control the size of the fibroids. I know that in number, they have increased. So, like, I think when we first discovered they came back, there was two. I believe there's five now. And what I've noticed is the size of my fibroids changes slightly, dependent on the amount of stress that I'm going through at that particular period of, when I get my ultrasound or not. Yeah, so during periods I get my ultrasound, if I'm just going through a more stressful period, my fibroids appear a little bit bigger than they had been, at the previous time when I was less stressed. Um, and I can't tell necessarily if it has reduced the size or the growth of the fibroids. It seems to be maintaining them around a certain range for now, so that seems to be working. Um, and but because it's a preventative, and because it's a preventative measure, I guess, on my behalf, there's no A/B test, right? So we didn't do nothing to see what might happen if we did nothing, because right now what we're working on is trying to preserve what fertility, if any, actually, remains within my reproductive system. um so it's hard to concretely answer how it's reduced my fibroids. It's kept them within a range, or at least it appears that it's keeping them within a range. Um, but there's no baseline as to say, categorically yes or no. It's had X particular type of impact on my fibroids or not.
And Kim, this is going to be a long-winded question, and comment, but please bear with me, it will make sense in the end. Before obtaining your copper IUD, did your doctor send you for an ultrasound, a sonohystogram, or even better, an MRI to rule out any new fibroid growth? Because you mentioned the number of fibroids found in your ultrasound prior to your surgery, and that during your surgery, the doctor found way more. I find this tends to be a common issue that I and many other women like yourself have experienced. When I had my uterine embolization, for example, the radiologist before my surgery did an MRI of my uterus to see the womb in its entirety and to see the fibroids that the sonohystogram may not have detected. When I had my myomectomy a year later to remove a sloughed away fibroid, the sonohystogram reported the fibroid measuring at the size of a tennis ball. But when the doctor went in for the surgery, it was the size of a grapefruit, which caused the surgery to take way longer. Now, I understand that MRIs are expensive for the Canadian healthcare system, but I personally believe that women with fibroids should require MRIs every 2 years, if not annually. Even you mentioned the importance of an annual in depth ultrasound. Now, outside of my radiologist, I had to strongly request my gynecologist to have an MRI for a recent detailed checkup. The reason I say all of this is why I asked about you regarding the copper IUD. I understand it is safer because it's hormone free, but I still question their safety for use post surgery from fibroids for women who have had fibroids prior. Many women like myself are not a candidate for the copper IUD because, number one, the fibroids either grew back post surgery prior to requesting the copper IUD, or second, not all the fibroids were removed during the initial surgery, leaving the womb still enlarged with fibroids. With copper IUDs causing heavy bleeding, and with documentation that copper IUDs could possibly increase the breeding ground for fibroids to grow and cause intrauterine chronic inflammation, I'm just concerned that they should have done more detailed testing prior to inserting your copper IUD. Was anything like this done?
I got my copper IUD in Nigeria um, for a number of reasons, including the fact that, culturally Nigeria is still quite conservative. Um, I went to a different hospital and got my IUD inserted by a different doctor that was unaware of my previous health history. Um, Truth be told, I wore a fake wedding ring and told him that, my husband and I had decided that we were going to engage in family planning, which is why I needed the IUD. He did ask if I'd had children before, and I said no, and he seemed hesitant to put it in. He seemed hesitant to insert it because I hadn't had kids before, but I was able to get him to do so. So with regards to the insertion of the IUD, I didn't have any sort of scans or any sort of activity to see whether there was any new fibroid growth or otherwise. That being said, I will note that I got my copper IUD about 3 months after my myomectomy. So I didn't wait very long in between. I got the copper IUD pretty quickly. I don't know. Again, I can't tell you conclusively whether the copper IUD has affected my fibroid growth in one way or another. I know there's also some messaging and some discourse around the potential of copper IUDs to give women heavier periods, etc. I've always had really very heavy periods from puberty, and so even when I had the copper IUD, for me, there didn't seem to be a dramatic enough change for me to say, oh, the copper drastically changed what my period experience looked like. I remember when I first started puberty, I would have such violent, it's actually, it seems a little dramatic, but yeah, I would have such violent period pains and periods that the school nurse had told me because I would get so sick I'd be sent to the nurse every month, and the school nurse told me that for some women, um, period pains are even more painful than labor contractions. I'm not sure I believe that, especially after my experience with pitocin, but no, it was with regards to the copper. I think I just had I've always been heavy, so I didn't notice any drastic changes that way. And then because I put it on, because I had it inserted so quickly, at the time of insertion, yeah, there shouldn't have been any fibroids but I couldn't tell you, um, how quickly the fibroids grew after I had the copper inserted. I believe I got the copper done. I'm gonna say either December 2017 or January 2018, and then we didn't realize, or I didn't realize that the fibroids had come back until I had an ultrasound. I want to say October of 2019. I was quite ill. I want to say I was quite ill August of 2018, but I don't recall now if an ultrasound was done at that point, and I don't believe they were looking for fibroids because from the blood work they could tell, it was malaria and heat exhaustion. Um, so yeah, I can't really speak to the copper IUD um, causing any sort of like chronic inflammation or any issues in me specifically. So, with regards to an MRI for monitoring my fibroids, um, I have there's two places that I go. There's a particular location that I go to that monitors, um, I believe, like the three biggest masses, and provides details on that. Then, in terms of my reporting, then there's another place I go to for my imaging that will give me details of all of the masses. That will give the doctor details of all of the masses that are found. Um, I tend to go to one, I think once a year or maybe once every 2 years now that my check-ins are less frequent. And so the more detailed one I think is an occasion, and more regularly I go to the one that's monitoring the three largest um, fibroids. I don't know at the time that an MRI would be the most useful. I believe right now, because of the size of the fibroids that I have right now, they're not eligible for surgery. We're just monitoring to see what they're doing and how they're developing. Um, Again, but around like the questions of fertility and preserving what fertility exists there. I think right now my fibroids are just under about an inch. In size. The biggest ones are, and I think maybe two of them are about, probably just under an inch in size, around an inch. And then the next two are probably about half that size. Um, and they might change in size by like half a centimeter or so, but not too much outside of that. Yeah, I've not requested an MRI. Um, that might be something I can think of considering with my doctor. Um, it's also maybe something that I could bring up in conversation. I think again, I think it's not come up because as of the moment, my fibroids aren't too disruptive of my day to day life. But if they were, then yeah, that would be something that I would do. But I definitely think that the more information you have about your health, the better able you are to make decisions for yourself, and informed decisions on the best ways to take care of that. So one of the things that I've been doing on my own, um, and I'm not meant to do this, but I know like with the place where I get my imaging done, they give me my results immediately, and I take them with me in hand to when I go see my specialist, my gynecologist. um, I actually keep a copy of my records of every test for myself, so that I have my own health information on hand, and I can see over time what's happening with the fibroids and how that's been progressing. Um, I haven't done the best job of managing my general health care with my GP. And so we've not had a lot of time, I think, to discuss my fibroids. And I've had some other health issues that I've brought kind of to the front of the table in my conversations with my GP. But I imagine as we kind of take care of the more pressing things than just monitoring the fibroids and how they impact my life will probably be a part of the conversations with my GP that way. I'm better able to make decisions not just with a specialist, but also with someone that's kind of watching my overall health and the health of my body, and can provide me with some support around decision making around that. But I'm a strong believer in advocacy, and if your test results aren't giving you enough information about what's going on in your body, um, I definitely will err on the side of pushing to be sure that you're heard, and pushing to request whatever is necessary to ensure that there's a more accurate understanding of what's going on in your body, the tests that you need to again just make better decisions, not just for yourself but also for the doctors, right?
I've read some research on the impact of vitamin D and uterine fibroids. For example, the National Institute of Environmental Health and Sciences article, Burden of Uterine Fibroids, An African Perspective, that one of the causes of fibroids is lack of or low vitamin D. For this reason, I personally have increased my vitamin D intake, especially living here in North America. But the study also features women who live in the continent of Africa. I would assume these women were obtaining enough vitamin D, unless they're avoiding the sun due to colorism or skin bleaching. What is your experience, or what have you heard on this matter, especially because you have lived on the continent?
Questions on vitamin D. Yeah, I'm not sure about again the influence of vitamin D levels and fibroids. This is something that I've seen no literature on, and so for me, again, I have no experience. I've got no position from which to make any sort of argument. Again, on that, my understanding is as a result of having darker skin, by and large, people with higher levels of melanin are are better able to absorb vitamin D from the sun. Um, but I haven't seen any tests on what the trends are with regards to vitamin D levels. I think I saw a few articles around COVID where they talked about vitamin D levels being higher, especially in Africa, which is why we weren't seeing as high infection rates um, from COVID as we were seeing in North America, for instance. And so, if that is actually factual, then that goes counter to the argument that a deficiency in vitamin D is what's causing high rates of um, of fibroids in women of African descent. That the logic right now for both seem to be in direct contradiction to each other. But I think again it boils down to my primary point, which is that we just don't understand enough about what's going on here, and as a condition that affects a lot of women, it's just highly under researched, and still very much of an enigma to much of the medical community. And I think that um, it behooves us as a society to encourage our professionals to do a better job of trying to understand what goes on in the bodies of um, non-stereotypical medical subjects, which by and large have largely been Caucasian males. I think we need to spend more time doing studies with the right levels of dignity and human rights observations, but we need to do more rigorous studies into understanding how women's bodies work, for instance, into understanding the differences in the what's the word I'm looking for? The differences in the normal results for different types of, for different groupings of individuals. We know that, for instance, a lot of Black presenting people, or a lot of Black people, tend to score on the lower end of normal, like blood levels. A lot of Black people tend to show up as anemic in regular testing. And so maybe we do need different, more universal measures as to what normal is, and more universal baselines that help us have just a broader and deeper understanding of what's actually going on in different people's bodies, and just better baselines, I think, in general. Um, yeah, I think it's such an understudied area, and worse yet, even under discussed area. Most women don't learn about fibroids until they themselves are in a medical emergency that has to do with fibroids, and um, I'm shocked by that, right? Like it amazes me that we were able to get word out about toxic shock syndrome around the use of tampons when it was becoming an issue in teenage populations around the world. And now every time you buy a box of tampons, there's literature in there about toxic shock syndrome, but we don't have literature about the other things that affect women's reproductive health, including things like fibroids, including things like endometriosis. But we know so many women whose lives are significantly negatively impacted by these issues and by these different health conditions. Again, there's just a need to encourage further study in this area and better understanding of what's going on, so that we can provide our scientists and our innovators with just a better foundation on which to help find actual workable solutions and actual remedies to the issues that people face. It's not impossible. We just have to do it in the same way that we fund research into male potency, etc. Perhaps it's time we move the lens to also study female potency and general health.
Regarding women of color, we know it's been medically stated that women with more melanin do produce more collagen, and this excess collagen can contribute to the growth of fibroids. In part one of our interview, you did bring up the topic of black hair care products, specifically perms, and the question if they really do cause fibroids. This is a current hot debate that I wanted to ask further to get your thoughts on the matter. You said that perming may not be a contributing factor since white women perm as well. Now, this is true that they do perm, but nowhere near as frequently or starting at an early age as those of the African diaspora. I remember girls as young as age 5 getting perms. Perms are harmful no matter what race, but especially those lye-based black relaxers that often burn your scalp always seemed more damaging compared to lye-based white perms. And now relaxers or perms have been questionably linked to causing cancer. What's your take on this?
So, I talked a little bit about, the discourse on hair products, specifically perms and relaxers causing fibroids in Black women. Again, I've pointed out that I'm not a subject area expert in this, and I've not read enough. I've not read or even seen enough like rigorous scholarly articles that speak to that. Um, and also just, record keeping and data keeping with regards to non-white male health patterns is not where it should be. So we do know that there is a high rate of fibroids, exponentially higher rate of fibroids in non-Caucasian women. A lot of Indian women and a lot of Asian women also suffer from fibroids. And I know that there is it's been proven that people with with more melanin produce more collagen, which can encourage the growth of fibroids. Um, um, but again, I'm thinking when I look at, for instance, in Indian populations that don't use hair relaxers the way that Black populations do, I'm not sure if there's actually that still, if there's still that causality um, with regards to the relaxers in terms of fibroid growth or not, or if there is a correlation. And because causality and correlation are, scientifically speaking, two different things. So causality means that we can definitely point to something to say that that is, X thing, this particular intervention or this event causes, what we see afterwards, right? Sometimes there are things that happen where we notice that there's a correlation. So if, for instance, trying to think of the best way to illustrate this. So if there is the presence of something, you're more likely to see the potential of, or you're more likely to see the potential of this other observed fact, right? So, I need a good analogy for this. And I'm reaching for a plant analogy, but it's not one that's going to make sense to a general audience. So I'm trying to think of a better way to explain this. Yeah, I think, I can't think of an analogy that's immediately accessible. But yeah, there might actually exist in Black and Brown communities a correlation between the types of chemicals that we are exposed to and the prevalence of fibroids. But what we know is we don't have enough tests to say that fibroids or the growth of fibroids is caused by this particular element, right? So let me think of another good example. But yeah, I think for me, with regards to the literature around fibroids, because it's just so understudied, what I've seen so far, for me as a scientist and as a social scientist, points towards correlation. So there might exist a relationship, but we don't know enough to say concretely that, this particular effect is caused by this particular incident or this particular activity. And that's why I think that, we need to study this more. And it needs to be, like we don't even have accurate figures on the rates of fibroids across populations, right? We have, it's a range that goes anywhere from 20 to 80%. And just from the fact that the numbers themselves are not accurate, any sort of conclusion that is drawn about what about the prevalence of fibroids, for me, like, not any, but a lot of conclusions for me are not as accurate, because your subject matter, your test matter doesn't even have, tight boundaries, right? So if you're talking about 20 to 80% of a certain population, you can't say 1 in 5 is very different to 4 in 5, right? Those are very different numbers. 1 in 5 means there's less of a chance of getting it. 4 in 5 means there's a higher chance of getting it. But of the 4 in 5, who even counts as the 4 in 5? How do we understand the parameters around that? So again, when I think about how, for instance, fibroids affects women of color, those numbers are so murky. Our understanding of it is so murky that it's very challenging for me to say categorically, the exposure to 1X type of chemical is what's causing that, especially when you think about the location and the placement of that chemical. Yes, relaxers are absorbed by the head. If it was a skin cancer, for instance, then that makes more sense. Like, I can see how that's a correlation that I think, like, ties in very closely to causation, but maybe not. But yeah, I think, when I come back to the conversations around like correlation and causation, I think that we are seeing correlations that need to be further explored to understand what the factors are, what the intervening factors are that actually do affect and influence causation. So I think, yeah, that's my response to that.
Thank you, Dr. Kalu. Dr. Nkem Kalu has made strong, crucial points throughout this interview, especially regarding the urgent need for further or continuous research on uterine fibroids due to there being limited studies. Studies that should include our last topic concerning the link between fibroids and relaxers. Here is an important point to make concluding this topic. Nkem mentioned the conflict between understanding the correlation between the location of fibroids and chemical relaxers, a common thought since fibroids grow in the uterus and perms are applied to the scalp. The case of perms or relaxers possibly causing uterine fibroids stems from the medical understanding that the estrogen hormone in excess encourages fibroid growth. The hormone that stimulates estrogen to rise is called the follicle-stimulating hormone, which is released by the pituitary gland located in the brain. The follicle-stimulating hormone is responsible for releasing the egg and activating the estrogen hormone. Now, according to the National Institute of Health, National Library of Medicine's 2012 journal titled Hair Relaxer Use and Risk of Uterine Leiomyomata in African American Women, states, the growth of uterine fibroids is affected by estrogen, luteinizing hormone, and follicle-stimulating hormone. High levels of hormone stimulate the rapid growth of fibroids in the uterus, end quote. Since perms or relaxers contact the scalp, and the scalp encases the brain, where the pituitary gland resides, the perm's toxic ingredients may be harmful to women hormonally. The article goes on to state, and makes an interesting note, that relaxer products may also contain hormonally active compounds such as phthalates, which are not required to be listed separately as ingredients and are often reported under the term fragrances or perfume, end quote. But something more to note during my research. Most of the medical journals I found discussing this topic were from around the years 2012, and there were maybe only 3 journals published. Nkem is unequivocally right. Further research and resources need to be made to answer questions like these and more, and advocacy for ongoing studies on uterine fibroids, especially for women of color. Further research will equip practitioners to clearly and consistently answer questions across the board and best support all women with uterine fibroids. I would like to thank Dr. Nkem Kalu for taking the time to share her transparent story and informative knowledge with us here at Freedom to Know Wellness. And thank you, listeners, for joining us for part 1 and 2 of the Freedom to Know Wellness podcast on uterine fibroids with guest Dr. Nkem Kalu. We hope this episode has benefited you, and if it has, please share it with others who would benefit from it too. And please subscribe to our channel and follow the Freedom to Know Wellness blog at freedomtoknowwellness.substack.com for listings of resources on today's topic and more. Thank you again, and be well.